Evelyn Hart pressed her cracked palms flat against her thighs and walked into that parlor like she had every right to be there because she had learned in 23 years of being invisible that the only armor left to a woman with nothing was the refusal to flinch. The room smelled of pipe smoke and judgment. William Coulter sat at the head of the table like a man who had already decided the shape of the world. Her sister Clara stood near the window in yellow silk, the color of new money. And across the room, Jack Coulter looked directly at Evelyn, not at Clara, and something in that suffocating summer air went very still. If you've ever been told your love wasn't worth choosing, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The thing nobody talked about afterward, not in the drawing rooms of Harker Creek, not in the feed store where men gathered to argue over water rights and cattle prices, not even in the church where Reverend Mills prayed loudly for the moral backbone of the valley, was how quiet it had been in that moment. How completely devastatingly quiet. Henry Hart had been talking for 20 minutes about grazing rights and seasonal water access when the door opened and Jack Coulter walked in. He was late. He was always late when his father hosted these things, these polite negotiations that were really just old men dividing up other people's lives over coffee that cost more than Evelyn earned in a week. Jack came in the way he always did, dust on his boots, sweat at his collar. No apology. He stopped in the doorway and looked across the room. He looked at Evelyn, not at Clara, who was seated at the right hand of William Coulter, in a yellow dress that had cost Henry Hart 3 months of hay income. Not at their father, who sat with his hat in his lap and his dignity in pieces on the floor. Not at William Coulter, who was mid-sentence about acreage. Jack looked at Evelyn Hart, standing in the corner near the window, because nobody had offered her a chair, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about for a long time. Evelyn felt it. She didn't understand it yet, but she felt it like a hand pressed flat against a fence post right before lightning strikes the ground. William Coulter finished his sentence about acreage and turned in his chair. "Jack, you're late." "I know it." Jack crossed the room and poured himself water from the pitcher on the sideboard. He didn't sit. "I heard the terms." "Good." William gestured at Clara with an open hand the way you'd present a purchase you were proud of. "Then we can move to the formal agreement. Miss Clara Hart has agreed in principle. I want to talk about that." Jack set his glass down. The room went tight in an instant. Henry Hart lifted his head. Clara's smile stayed in place, but her eyes sharpened. William Coulter's jaw moved once like he was chewing something unpleasant, and then he very carefully set his own coffee cup on its saucer. "Jack." His voice was the kind of quiet that meant the opposite of calm. "We have discussed this." "You discussed it." Jack looked at his father steadily. "I listened. Now I'm talking." "Son, Miss Clara's a fine woman." Jack meant it. That was the part that would be hardest for people to understand later when they tried to make the story cleaner than it was. He wasn't dismissing Clara. He was just telling the truth. She's accomplished. She's kind. She deserves a man who wants her specifically. That man ain't me. Clara made a sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a word. Just a sound small and swallowed quickly. Evelyn watched her sister's hands fold tight in her lap. Henry Hart stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "Now see here, Mr. Hart." Jack didn't raise his voice. He just turned, and something in the way he held himself, still certain, not aggressive, but absolutely unmovable, made Henry stop. "I mean no disrespect to you or to Clara, none whatsoever. But I'm 31 years old, and I will not enter a marriage I chose for the wrong reasons." The wrong reasons. William Coulter said it like the words tasted bad. "The agreement has been drafted, not signed." Jack looked at his father. "You know the difference." "What I know," William said, and now his voice had lost its careful quiet and become something else entirely, something with teeth, something that had made grown men step backward, "is that you are standing in my house in front of our guests and embarrassing this family. I'm telling the truth in front of our guests. You can call it what you want. The silence that followed was the kind that changes a room permanently. Evelyn would think about it later, how certain silences don't end. They just get covered over, and you can still feel them underneath everything that comes after. William Coulter looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at the Hart girls, at Clara, composed and pale, and then at Evelyn standing very still near the window with her hands flat at her sides. "Then what?" William said slowly. "Are you suggesting—" Jack turned. He turned and looked at Evelyn directly, clearly, without apology or hesitation, and he said, "I'm suggesting I'd like to speak with Miss Evelyn, if she's willing." The room didn't just go quiet. It seemed to stop existing altogether for a moment. Henry Hart made a sound like a man who'd been struck somewhere internal. Clara turned her head toward the window. William Coulter went very, very still, the kind of stillness that precedes something severe, like the air before a summer storm rolls in off the mountains. And Evelyn Hart stood in her worn gray dress, with the fraying hem and the mended collar, and thought with a clarity that surprised even herself, "This is going to cost me something." She didn't know yet how much. "Miss Evelyn?" Jack's voice dropped lower, meant just for her now. "Would you step outside with me, just to talk? I'd just like—" He paused, searched for the right words, and didn't quite find them. "I'd just like to talk." Evelyn looked at her father. Henry Hart's face had gone a color she'd never seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but something worse. Something humiliated and helpless and turning fast toward fury. "You will do no such thing," Henry said. His voice shook. "Sit down, Evelyn. You will sit." "Papa." Her voice came out soft. That surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She had expected to sound frightened. She didn't. "I heard him ask me. You are not part of this conversation." "Jack Coulter just made me part of it." She met her father's eyes without looking away. "Are you telling me I don't have the right to answer for myself?" Henry's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Mr. Hart." William Coulter's voice cut across the room like a blade. "I apologize for my son's behavior, deeply. I assure you this is not—" "It's exactly what it looks like," Jack said. "Jack, I'm not apologizing for it." He looked at Evelyn again. "Will you come outside, Miss Evelyn?" Later, Evelyn would not be able to tell you what made her say yes. She had 17 reasons to say no. Her father's face, Clara's stillness, the weight of a room full of expectation pressing her back toward invisibility, toward the corner, toward the version of herself that had spent years learning to take up as little space as possible. She said yes anyway. She walked past. Her father felt his hand reach and then stop, like he thought better of touching her, and she followed Jack Coulter out through the side door into the white-hot summer afternoon. The heat outside was brutal, dry and absolute, the kind that sits on your shoulders like a second body, the kind that makes every decision feel permanent. Jack stood a few feet away with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked at the middle distance a moment before turning back to her. "I know how that looked in there," he said. "It looked," Evelyn said carefully, "like you humiliated my sister in front of your father." "I know it." He held her gaze. "And I'm sorry for the way it happened, but I'm not sorry for saying it." "You don't even know me." "I know enough. You know I work my father's south pasture when the hired hands call in sick. You know I've fixed fence line in July heat. You know I don't talk much at social functions." She kept her voice even and flat. "That's not knowing a person, Mr. Coulter. You're right." He didn't argue it. That surprised her. She had expected deflection, the practiced social smoothness of a man raised with money. She got none of it. "But I've watched how you move through a room, Miss Evelyn. How you listen when other people think you're not. How you look at land like you actually understand what it means." He paused. "I've been watching you for 2 years." Evelyn's heart did something complicated that she refused to acknowledge. "What you did in there," she said. "You understand what that means for my family, for the agreement between your father and mine." "I do." "The water access, the grazing rights. If William withdraws—" "He won't." Jack's jaw tightened. "I'll make sure of it." "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted. "I can't promise it. but I'm asking you to give me the chance to try." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking if you'd consider letting me court you proper. If you want it. If you don't." He opened one hand, a gesture that was honest and unguarded, in a way that caught her off balance. "You say the word, and I'll go back in there and figure something else out. But I needed you to know you had the choice. I needed you to know somebody was giving you the choice." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. The heat pressed down on both of them, and somewhere behind the house a horse stamped and blew, and the smell of dry grass was everywhere, warm and dusty and real. "Why?" she asked. True answer, not the polite one. Jack was quiet a moment. "Because Clara would have made peace with whatever I gave her," he said finally. "And I think you'd tell me if I was wrong." Something shifted in his expression then, just a crack in the steadiness, brief and honest. "I reckon I need someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong." Evelyn thought about that, about her father inside, about the agreement coming apart at the seams, about Clara's folded hands and downcast eyes. "I'll think on it," she said. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no, and they both knew exactly what that meant. When they walked back inside, the room had rearranged itself. William Coulter stood at the fireplace with his back to the door. Henry Hart sat in his chair with his hat in both hands, turning it round and round, a man wringing the last of his composure out of something he couldn't control. Clara was still at the table, her coffee untouched, her face a blank so controlled it must have cost her everything to maintain it. Clara looked at Evelyn when she came back in. Evelyn looked back. She wanted to say something, she didn't know what. She wanted to say, "I didn't plan this." She wanted to say, "I'm sorry." What she said was nothing, because the room didn't leave space for it. William Coulter turned from the fireplace and looked at his son with an expression that could have meant any number of things, and likely meant all of them at once. "We'll discuss this privately," William said. "There's nothing private about it," Jack said. "I said what I said in front of everyone here. I'll stand by it in front of everyone. You are making a mistake." "Maybe." Jack didn't flinch. "But it's mine to make." Henry Hart rose to his feet. He was a tall man, had been broader once before the drought years, and the bad seasons had taken something out of him. And when he stood now, he looked at Jack Coulter with something that went far beyond offense, into territory that had no clean name. "My daughter," Henry said, "is not something you try on to see if it fits." "Mr. Hart." Jack's voice stayed respectful but firm. "That's exactly right. She's not, which is why I asked her, not you." Henry turned to Evelyn then, and what she saw in his face in that moment was the thing she would carry longest. Not anger, not humiliation, though those were present. What she saw was grief, the look of a man losing something he hadn't known he possessed until the precise moment it slipped away. "You said yes," Henry said. Flat, certain, an accusation disguised as a statement. "I said I'd think on it." Her voice stayed quiet. "That's my right, Papa." "You're right." He said the words strangely, like a man testing the weight of something foreign in his mouth. He put his hat on his head. "Get your things, Clara. We're leaving." Clara rose without a word. She was beautiful and composed, and her eyes were dry, and she walked past Evelyn without looking at her, and Evelyn felt something tear, small, quiet, but real, somewhere behind her sternum, where she kept things she didn't talk about. At the door, Henry Hart turned back one final time. He looked at William Coulter. "I expect our existing agreements to stand." William's expression didn't shift by a single degree. "I'll consider it." Henry's face hardened. He looked at Jack. He looked at Evelyn. He walked out without speaking another word to either of them. The door shut. The room held what was left. William Coulter clasped his hands behind his back and moved to the window. The afternoon heat pressed flat against the glass. He stood with his back to the room for a long moment. "You understand," William said quietly to the room, or to his son, or to the specific weight of the air between them. "What you've done." "Yes, sir," Jack said. "You've put this family—" "I've been honest." Jack's voice didn't waver, but something underneath it had gone tired. "I know that don't make it easier. It makes it considerably harder. William turned from the window. He looked at Evelyn, then really looked at her, studied her the way a man studies something he hasn't yet decided how to categorize. His eyes were pale and intelligent and gave nothing away. "Your mother's name was Margaret," William said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." "She worked the Hendricks place before your father bought his land." "She did?" "Hard woman." He said it without judgment, almost like a notation in a ledger. "Good with horses." "Yes, sir." William Coulter nodded once slowly, the way a man files something away for future use. He looked back at his son. "You'll both come to dinner Sunday," he said. "We will discuss this like adults." He let that word hang a deliberate moment. "And Jack, if you're going to do this, you will do it right. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." William left the room without another word. Jack and Evelyn stood alone in the Coulter parlor, with the heat pressing through the windows, and the remains of two families' carefully arranged expectations scattered between them like broken crockery on a Sunday floor. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "You're going to get asked a lot of questions," Jack said. "I know. People are going to say things. People have always said things." She looked at him directly. "I've survived it before." He almost smiled then. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but she saw the edge of it, something genuine flickering underneath the dust and the steadiness. "You said you'd think on it," he said. "I meant it. Fair enough?" He moved toward the door and paused with his hand on the frame, looking back at her one final time. And in his expression, she saw something she couldn't quite name. Not hope exactly, but something that lived in the same neighborhood. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Evelyn. I don't know how this goes. I just know I couldn't do the other thing." She watched him leave. She stood alone in the parlor of the Coulter ranch in her worn gray dress and put one hand flat against the wall to steady herself. Not because she was afraid, but because the world had just changed shape and she needed a moment before she trusted her own footing. Nobody had ever chosen her before. Not like that. Not loudly in a room full of people at a cost she could already begin to calculate and still couldn't see the bottom of. She had spent 23 years being the one who stayed, who worked, who made do without complaint, who never expected to be the one anyone reached for. And in the space of 20 minutes, everything had tilted on its axis, and she did not know yet whether she was falling or rising. Evelyn Hart picked up her hat from the chair by the door and walked out of the Coulter house into the brutal summer afternoon. She went to the water trough at the edge of the yard and put her face in her hands. Not crying, just breathing, just putting herself back together in the particular way she had learned over 23 years of practice. Then she lifted her head and looked out at the valley. It was beautiful country, wide and hard and brutally honest about what it asked of you. The grass was dry and golden, and the mountains sat blue and heavy on the horizon. And somewhere down the road, her father was driving home with her sister beside him, and a silence between them that was going to take a very long time to fill. She thought about what Jack had said. "I reckon I need someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong." She thought about Clara's folded hands. She thought about her father's face, that grief she hadn't expected, that loss he hadn't seen coming. And she thought whatever comes next, whatever falls apart or holds together. Whatever this costs her, whatever it costs all of them, she had answered for herself. In that room, in that heat in front of all of them, nobody had answered for her. For 23 years, she had been invisible by design, by survival, by the slow accumulation of 100 small moments in which other people's needs had taken up all the available space. Today, she had taken up space. That would have to be enough to start with. She walked to her horse. She mounted. She rode out into the valley with the sun bearing down and the dry wind in her face and the whole complicated, uncertain, frightening weight of what she had just set in motion riding alongside her like a second shadow. And behind her in the house on the ridge, William Coulter stood at the window and watched her go with an expression that nobody was there to read, something between calculation and something older and quieter that he would not have named, even if asked. The day Jack Coulter said Evelyn Hart's name in that room, that was the day the valley divided. People would argue about it for years, about who was right, about what it cost, about what it started. about who deserved what came next and who didn't see it coming. But every last one of them agreed on one thing. Nothing in Harker Creek was ever quite the same after that afternoon. Nothing was. The ride home took 40 minutes. It felt longer. Evelyn kept her horse at a steady walk because she needed the time more than she needed the speed, and the valley stretched out around her in the late afternoon heat, golden and indifferent. She ran through what had happened in the Coulter parlor, the way you run your tongue over a broken tooth, testing the damage, not quite believing it yet. By the time the Hart Ranch came into view, her father's wagon was already parked in front of the house. He'd driven faster than she had. He'd had somewhere to be angry. She dismounted, tied her horse, and walked through the front door. Henry Hart was standing in the middle of the front room, with his arms crossed, and his face the color of old brick. Clara sat at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking. Neither of them spoke when Evelyn came in. The silence had a shape to it, deliberate, and loaded, the kind that has been rehearsed. Henry broke it first. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand, Papa." "I said sit down." Evelyn sat. Not because she was afraid of him. Because she was tired, and the chair was there, and she had learned a long time ago that choosing your battles meant letting some things go, so you had the energy left for what mattered. Henry looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked. "You understand what you've done." "I told a man I'd think about his offer. That's what I've done. That is not—" He stopped, started again, lower and tighter. "That is not what happened. What happened is you walked out of that room with Jack Coulter in front of his father and our entire arrangement, and you—" "He asked me to step outside. I went. Without my permission. I'm 23 years old, Papa." Her voice stayed even. She was working hard to keep it there. "When was the last time you needed to give me permission to speak to someone?" Henry turned away from her. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back rigid and his hands knotted behind him, and after a long moment, he said very quietly, "William Coulter controls the eastern water feed." The room changed. Evelyn heard what he was really saying. She heard the whole thing underneath it, the shape of a debt she hadn't known existed, the outline of a problem larger than a marriage arrangement. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means," Henry said, still to the window, "that if this agreement falls apart, we lose access to the creek feed by September. The south pasture dries out. We lose the cattle we've got left, and we don't recover from that. We don't." He turned then, and for the first time in her life, Evelyn saw her father look genuinely old. "I needed that agreement, Evelyn. Not as a nicety. I needed it." The weight of that landed between them on the floor. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because it wasn't your concern." "I'm your daughter." "It wasn't your concern," he said again, and the wall went back up behind his eyes, and he was finished with the conversation in that particular direction. "Now, you're going to send word to the Coulter Ranch. You're going to decline whatever offer Jack made, politely. And this family is going to salvage what it can from—" "No." Silence. Henry turned slowly. "Excuse me. I said no." Evelyn looked at her father without flinching. "I told Jack I would think on it. I am thinking on it. When I've thought on it, I will give him my answer. That's my answer to you." Henry Hart stared at his daughter like a man looking at something he built with his own hands that has turned around and surprised him completely. "If you do this," he said slowly, "if you pursue this, whatever this is, and the agreement with William collapses, that is on you. You understand that every consequence that follows will be the result of decisions made by grown men who built an arrangement around my sister's future without asking her," Evelyn said. "I'm sorry about the water rights, Papa. I truly am. But I will not be traded to fix a problem I didn't create." Henry walked out of the room. The door to his study shut hard enough that the walls felt it. Evelyn sat at the table and breathed and looked at the cup in front of her that nobody had filled. After a long moment, Clara set the coffee pot down and poured for her without a word. Evelyn looked up at her sister. Clara sat back down across from her and wrapped her hands around her own cup and looked at the table. "You could have warned me," Evelyn said, gently, Not an accusation, just the truth. I didn't know he was going to do it. Clara's voice was quiet and precise. I knew he was going to choose between us. I assumed he'd choose sensibly. And sensibly meant you. Sensibly meant the one father prepared for it. Clara looked up then, and Evelyn saw something in her sister's face she hadn't expected. Not anger, not wounded pride, but something older and flatter that looked a great deal like exhaustion. I've been prepared for this particular arrangement for 8 months, Evelyn. 8 months of lessons on Coulter land management and dinner conversation and how to manage a household at that scale. She paused. I didn't want it either. The air between them shifted. Clara, I didn't want it, Clara said again, clear and firm. But I would have done it because Father needed it done, and I thought at least I could be useful. She looked at her cup. I'm not angry at you. I want you to know that. I'm angry at the situation. I'm angry that this is what our options look like. She made a short, humorless sound. I'm mostly angry that Jack Coulter has apparently been watching you for 2 years, and the most romantic thing he could devise was embarrassing both of us in front of our father. Despite everything, Evelyn almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale. I thought the same thing. He could have spoken to you any number of times on his own. Clara shook her head. Instead, he waited until it was as dramatic as possible. He's a man. They do love a grand gesture. Clara met her eyes then, and something passed between them, something warm and solid, underneath all the difficulty, the particular understanding of 2 women who have shared a life. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, Evelyn said honestly. I told him I'd think on it. And what does your thinking say? Evelyn was quiet a moment. It says I'm scared. It says this is going to cost all of us something. It says... She stopped. Started again. It says nobody has ever looked at me the way he did in that room, and I don't know what to do with that. Clara was quiet for a long time. Then you think on it, she said finally. And whatever you decide, I'm your sister before I'm Father's daughter. She stood up and smoothed her dress and picked up her cup. Just know that if you marry that man, and he makes you miserable, I will feel no sympathy whatsoever. Evelyn watched her sister walk out of the kitchen, and for the first time since leaving the Coulter ranch that afternoon, something in her chest loosened slightly. She still had no idea what was coming, but she wasn't entirely alone in it. That was something. Sunday came too fast. Evelyn spent the days between in the south pasture up before dawn fence work in the early morning, before the heat became unmanageable water checks, in the afternoon account books, by lamplight after supper. Her father barely spoke to her. He was civil at meals in the stiff way of a man performing civility because he'd been raised to. But the warmth was gone from it, and they both knew it, and neither of them reached across the distance. On Friday, a boy from the Coulter ranch rode up with a note. It was brief. Jack's handwriting was practical and unadorned, the handwriting of a man who wrote because he had to, not because he enjoyed it. Sunday at 6. My father expects us both. I'll come for you at 5:30 if that suits. J.C. Evelyn read it twice, wrote back 2 words. That suits. Sent it back with the boy. She didn't sleep well Saturday night. Jack arrived at 5:20, which told her he was nervous even though nothing else about him showed it. He wore a clean shirt and his good hat, and he held it in his hands when he came to the door, which Henry opened, and the 2 men looked at each other across the threshold, with the particular careful tension of men who have been in a room together when everything went wrong and haven't sorted out what to do about it yet. Mr. Hart, Jack said. Henry said nothing. He stepped back from the door and let Evelyn through, and that was all. She and Jack rode to the Coulter ranch without speaking much. The evening was still hot, the kind of heat that doesn't lift at sundown in July, and the road was dry and pale in the long light. How bad was it? Jack asked halfway there. Bad enough. Your father, he'll manage. She paused. He's always managed. That's what he does. Jack nodded. My father's going to test you tonight. I assumed. He tests everyone. It's not personal, it's just... He stopped. Actually, it is personal. He does it to find out what a person's made of. And if I don't pass his test, Jack looked at her, then we'll have a problem. But I don't think that's going to happen. You don't know what I'm like at dinner. No, he said, but I know what you're like when a man twice your age tells you to sit down and you decide not to. The edge of that almost smile again. I reckon you'll be fine. The Coulter house in the evening was a different thing than it had been in the afternoon of the negotiation. The lamps were lit, and the table was set with the kind of careful formality that announced itself as performance china, that came out for guest silver, that stayed polished to make a point. A housekeeper moved in and out of the kitchen. William Coulter stood at the head of the table, already as if he'd been standing there for some time, as if the room arranged itself around him, rather than the other way. He looked at Evelyn when she came in, that same considering look, that same flat, intelligent appraisal. "Miss Hart," he said, "I'm glad you came." "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Coulter." She held his gaze. "I appreciate directness." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement of a move in a game he hadn't expected. "Sit," he said. "Let's eat." The first 20 minutes were ordinary. Food was passed. Questions were asked about the Hart Ranch. Polite questions, the kind that are really assessments in formal clothing. How many head of cattle did they run in the south pasture? What was their arrangement with the Delaney mill? Had her father considered rotating the east field this season? Evelyn answered every question directly, accurately, and without performing deference. William watched her the way a man watches an unfamiliar horse. Not unkindly, but with the evaluating patience of someone who needs to know what they're dealing with before they commit. "Your mother," he said between the main course and the next, managed the Hendricks accounts for 3 years. "She did. I knew her slightly. Smart woman. She understood land value before most men in this valley did." He picked up his glass. "You take after her. In some ways." "Which ways?" "The useful ones, I hope." She met his eyes. "The accounts, the assessments, the understanding that land is only worth what you can actually do with it, not what you paid for it." William set his glass down. "And the others?" he asked. "Excuse me, the ways you don't take after her." He leaned back slightly. "Your mother was a practical woman. She married a man she knew she could manage. Kept her ambitions inside the limits of what was available to her." He looked at Evelyn steadily. "You appear to be a different calculation." The table went quiet. Jack had stopped eating. His fork was in his hand, but he wasn't using it. Evelyn looked at William Coulter and understood clearly and precisely what he was doing, drawing a line in the architecture of the dinner, putting her on one side of it, waiting to see what she'd do. "My mother," Evelyn said carefully, "made the best decision she could with what she was given. I have been given slightly more than she was. I intend to use it." She paused. "I don't think that's a problem for anyone at this table who isn't afraid of the answer to a question they didn't think to ask." Silence. William Coulter looked at her for a very long moment. Then he laughed. It was short and genuine, and clearly surprised him as much as it surprised anyone else. "Jack," he said without looking away from Evelyn, "pass me the bread." The dinner didn't become warm after that, but it became honest, which in Evelyn's experience was better. What she didn't expect, what blindsided her completely, was what happened after, when the meal was done, and Jack was talking with the housekeeper about something in the hall, and she found herself alone with William Coulter in the sitting room for exactly 4 minutes. He looked at her and said, flat and quiet and without preamble, "My son is going to inherit a problem." Evelyn went still. "Sir, not a small one." He looked at the fireplace, which was unlit in the summer heat, just a dark mouth in the wall. "There are things about this ranch's history that Jack doesn't fully know, that I have arranged for him not to know until he was ready to handle them." He turned and looked at her with those pale, assessing eyes. "I'm not certain he'll ever be ready to handle them alone." Evelyn held very still inside. She made her face neutral, and her breathing even. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked me for the direct version," William said. "And because if you're going to be in this family, you need to understand that it is not a simple thing to inherit." He looked at her. "My question is, whether you'd run from that or toward it." Before she could answer, Jack came back into the room, and William turned to his son with the same composed expression he'd had all evening, and the conversation closed like a door complete and without a seam. Evelyn rode home in the dark beside Jack and did not tell him what his father had said. She tucked it somewhere interior and quiet and turned it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what lies underneath. Something was wrong with the Coulter land. Something William knew. Something Jack didn't. She didn't know yet what it was. She would find out. That was not a question. The town of Harker Creek took approximately 3 days to have a full opinion about Evelyn Hart. She heard it first at the general store on Tuesday, which was her day to collect the ranch's supply order and post her father's correspondence. She came in, and 2 women from the Methodist Ladies' Aid stopped talking and rearranged themselves with the particular precise efficiency of people who had been discussing you and don't want you to know it. Evelyn knew it. She collected her order from the counter and said nothing, and was almost to the door when Margaret Sloan, wife of the county clerk, 45 years old, a woman who had strong feelings about the correct order of things, said to her companion at a volume that was not accidental, "She's always been strange, that one. Working like a field hand, and now chasing after well." The well sat in the air. Evelyn stopped walking. She turned around. She looked at Margaret Sloan directly. Margaret Sloan looked back with the expression of a woman who expected either a flinch or a retreat, and had prepared herself for either. "Mrs. Sloan," Evelyn said pleasantly, "if you've got something to say about me, you're welcome to say it to my face. I'm right here." Margaret Sloane's companion made a small sound. "I wasn't," Margaret began. "You were," Evelyn said, still pleasant, still clear. "And that's fine. People talk. But I'd appreciate if you'd do me the courtesy of doing it where I can hear it and respond. I reckon that's the honest way." She turned and walked out of the general store. Her hands were shaking slightly. She didn't let it show until she was outside and had her back to the door. She had been handling people's opinions about her since she was 12 years old, and her mother had died, and the town had decided all sorts of things about what that meant for the Hart family, and specifically for the girl who looked too much like work and not enough like decoration. She was used to it. She was used to it. That didn't mean it didn't cost her something. She was stacking the supply boxes into the wagon when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her and turned to find Jack Coulter standing there with a folded piece of paper in his hand and an expression that suggested he had been looking for her. "What are you doing in town?" she asked. "Looking for you, apparently." He held up the paper. "This came for you at the ranch. One of your father's hands brought it over this morning. I offered to save him the extra ride." He paused. "I may have also been in town anyway." Evelyn took the paper. She didn't open it yet. She looked at him. "Did you hear what happened inside?" "I heard enough." He looked at the store door, then back at her. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "Evelyn." She looked up at him at the use of her name, just her name, plain without the miss, the first time he'd said it that way. Something about it landed differently than she expected. "I'm fine," she said again, and this time she meant it more than the first time. "I've been managing Margaret Sloane's opinion since I was 12. "That doesn't mean you should have to." "No," she agreed. "But I do, and I'm good at it." She put the paper in her coat pocket. "You can't be upset on my behalf every time someone in this town decides to have an opinion, Jack. There are going to be a lot of opinions. A lot of them." He looked at her steadily. "I know it." "Then you need to decide if you can live with that. Because I already know I can." That stopped him. Whatever he had been prepared to say, that wasn't the direction he'd expected the conversation to go. "Can I walk with you?" he asked. "I'm heading back to the ranch. I'll ride with you part of the way." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she climbed up onto the wagon and made room on the seat. He tied his horse to the back and climbed up beside her, and they drove out of Harker Creek together past the feed store and the church and the 2 women who had come to the door of the general store to watch them go, and Evelyn looked straight ahead and drove and did not give them the satisfaction of a glance. She opened the letter at the first bend in the road with Jack beside her because there was nobody else to open it with, and she was tired of doing everything alone. It was from the county land office. The water access dispute between the Hart property and the Coulter Eastern feed had been filed for formal review by William Coulter 3 weeks ago, before the Sunday dinner, before the negotiation meeting, before any of this. Evelyn read it twice, folded it precisely, put it back in her pocket. "What is it?" Jack asked. She looked at him. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched his face as he read it. The stillness that came over him, the particular quality of quiet that was different from his usual quiet, sharper at the edges. He folded it and gave it back. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Did you know?" Evelyn asked. "No." The word came out flat and certain. "Your father filed this before we had dinner at his table," she said. "Before he told me," she stopped, decided. "He told me Sunday evening that you were going to inherit a problem. He said there were things about this ranch's history you didn't know." Jack went very still. "He told you that when you were in the hall." Jack looked at the road ahead. His jaw was tight. "And you didn't tell me." "I was trying to figure out what it meant first." She looked at him directly. "What does it mean, Jack? What's wrong with your father's land?" He didn't answer right away. The wagon moved down the road, and the heat pressed on them from above and from the pale dust rising around the wheels. And she let the silence sit, because she'd learned that silence applied with patience was the best way to hear what a man was actually thinking. "I don't know," he finally said. "But I'm going to find out. If the water dispute goes to formal review," Evelyn said, "my father loses the South pasture feed by September, regardless of what we decide between us. Your father knows that. He filed this before the dinner, before the negotiation." She paused, letting that arrange itself in the air between them. "That means this has never been about the marriage agreement." Jack looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean your father has been moving on this water dispute independently. The marriage arrangement was separate. Maybe he intended to use it as leverage. Maybe—" She stopped. "I don't know what he intended, but the two things are not the same thing, and the fact that nobody has separated them until now is a problem." Jack said nothing. She looked at him. "Your father is not a simple man." "No," Jack said quietly. "He's not." They rode in silence the rest of the way to the Hart property line. Jack stopped the wagon there and climbed down and unhitched his horse. He stood at the side of the road with the reins in his hands and looked up at her with an expression she'd been learning to read, the look of a man working through something that had more layers than he'd thought it did. "I'm sorry," he said. "About the letter. About my father." He paused. "About all of it. Don't apologize for things you didn't do." She looked at him. "Find out what he's actually done. That's more useful." "Yes, ma'am." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the direction of one. "Don't call me ma'am." "Yes." He stopped, almost smiled back. "Right." She clicked the horse forward and drove on to Heartland and did not look back at him, though she felt him standing there watching until she was out of sight. She drove to the barn and unhitched and put the horse up and went into the house, and her father was in the kitchen, and she sat down across from him and put the letter on the table between them. Henry looked at it. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. "You knew," she said. Not a question. "I suspected." His voice was tired. "I found out 2 days ago." "And you didn't tell me." "Evelyn." "Papa." She kept her voice level. This was becoming a particular kind of conversation. They kept having her trying to be part of decisions that affected her life, him drawing the line between what he considered her concern and what he didn't. "This affects our land. It affects my life. I have a right to know what's happening. I was trying to protect you from what? The truth." She leaned forward. "The truth is coming regardless. It always does. The only difference is whether I find out with time to think or after it's already done." Henry looked at the letter on the table. He looked older today than he'd looked last week. Every day since the Coulter parlor, he seemed to have moved a little further into some interior space where she couldn't quite reach him. "The water dispute," she said, "is real, and it's been filed, and it will go to review. Whatever happens with Jack and me, that is separate now. You need to understand that." Henry looked up at her. "It's not separate. If you're involved with that family, then we have information they don't know we have," Evelyn said. "That is not nothing, Papa." Silence. Henry Hart looked at his daughter across the kitchen table in the fading evening light, and something shifted in his face. Not surrender exactly, but the first small crack in the wall he'd been maintaining since Sunday. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying, I'm going to find out what William Coulter actually has on this land," she said. "And I'm saying that before I give Jack my answer, before I give anyone any answer, I need to know what we're actually standing on." Henry was quiet for the long moment. "How?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She looked at him steadily. "But I'm working on it." She went to her room that night and lit the lamp and sat at her small desk and opened her mother's old account ledgers, the ones she'd inherited, not because Henry had given them to her, but because she'd found them in the bottom of a trunk the winter after her mother died and had taught herself to read them. Her mother's handwriting was small and precise numbers, arranged with the same economy she'd apparently applied to everything. Evelyn turned the pages slowly, looking for something she didn't know how to name yet. She got to the entry dated July 1871 and stopped. The number next to it was not a number she recognized. The name next to that number was not the Coulter Ranch. It was a company name, a land-holding company, and next to the company name in her mother's small, careful writing were two words that made Evelyn's chest go cold. Water rights. And beneath that, underlined twice W.C. fraudulent claim W.C. William Coulter. Evelyn sat very still in her small room with the lamp burning, and the summer heat sitting heavy on the walls, and the valley dark and quiet outside. Her mother had known something. Years ago, her mother had suspected something, and she had written it in this ledger in handwriting so small and careful, it looked like she'd been afraid of being caught. Evelyn's hands were completely steady. Her mind was not. She closed the ledger, opened it again, read the entry one more time to make sure she had it right. She did. Whatever William Coulter had built his empire on, whatever the shape of the problem Jack was going to inherit, her mother had seen the edge of it 15 years ago and had been afraid to say it out loud. Evelyn was not afraid to say things out loud, but she wasn't going to say this one yet. Not until she understood what she was holding. Not until she knew how far back it went and how deep it ran and what it was actually going to cost to bring it into the light. Because some truths, if you speak them too early, disappear. Get buried. Get managed by the people they threaten. This one needed to be ready before it was spoken. She blew out the lamp. She sat in the dark and thought, and somewhere across the valley in the house on the ridge, a light burned late in William Coulter's study, and he sat at his desk with his own papers and his own calculations, and whatever he was looking at, it kept him up well past midnight. Two people on the same valley floor sitting in the dark, each holding a piece of something that the other didn't know they had. Not yet. She waited 2 days before she told him, not because she was afraid, because she needed to be certain she understood what she was holding before she put it in someone else's hands. She spent those 2 days going through every page of her mother's ledger, twice cross-referencing dates against the county land maps she'd pulled from her father's filing cabinet, matching numbers to records that should have lined up and didn't. The discrepancy wasn't subtle once you knew where to look. It was just buried in enough paperwork and enough years that nobody had thought to look. On Thursday morning, she saddled her horse before dawn and rode to the Coulter Ranch. Jack was already in the yard when she arrived. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him set down what he was carrying without a word. "Walk with me," she said. They walked to the far edge of the north corral, where the hands weren't within earshot. And Evelyn took the ledger out of her saddlebag and handed it to him, open to the page with her mother's handwriting. She watched him read it. She watched his face go through 3 separate things in quick succession: confusion, then understanding, then something that sat below understanding in the place where a man keeps the truths he doesn't want to be true. He read it twice. "WC," he said. "You're certain that's—" "My mother worked land accounts for 15 years. She didn't make notes like that without reason." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "The water rights your father filed on the ones in the formal dispute review. The deed filing date doesn't match the county register. Someone moved the date. I don't know who filed the paperwork, but the original claim and the filed claim are 2 different documents." Jack closed the ledger. He handed it back to her. He stood very still for a moment with his hands at his sides and his jaw tight and his eyes on something she couldn't see. "How long have you known?" he asked. 2 days. "Why didn't you—" "Because I needed to be sure." She looked at him. "I'm sure." Jack turned and walked 3 steps away and stopped. She let him. She'd learned that about him in these weeks, that he needed a short distance to process something before he could turn back around and talk about it. It wasn't avoidance. It was the way he worked. He turned back. "My father filed a fraudulent claim on water rights that may have belonged to neighboring ranches, including yours." He said it flat and even, like a man reading an indictment he'd written himself. "And your mother found evidence of it 15 years ago and wrote it down in a ledger that's been sitting in your house since she died." "Yes." "And nobody knew. Nobody who was going to do anything about it." Evelyn held his gaze. "Jack, I need to know what you want to do with this." He looked at her. The question sat between them with full weight. "I need to talk to my father," he said. "I know. Alone. I know that too." She held the ledger out to him. "Take it. He needs to see it." Jack shook his head. "Keep it. That's your family's document. It stays with you." He pulled in a long breath. "Give me until evening. Then I'll find you." He found her at 4 o'clock, which told her the conversation with William had gone badly faster than expected. She was mending fence at the Hart property's east edge when she heard his horse and turned. He dismounted and came toward her, and she put down her tools and waited, reading his face on the approach, and what she read there was something she hadn't seen on him before. It was fury. Controlled and cold and contained, which made it worse than the loud kind. "He knew I knew," Jack said when he was close enough that his voice didn't carry. "The moment I walked in, he could see it on me. He didn't even pretend surprise." He stopped in front of her. He said the water rights dispute was a negotiating tool, that he intended to use it as leverage to bring your father back to the table after the marriage agreement fell through. His jaw worked. He said he was protecting the ranch. Evelyn waited. "I asked him about the deed dates." Jack's voice dropped lower. "He said that was a clerical error from 20 years ago that had already been reviewed and corrected." "It hasn't been corrected," Evelyn said. "I checked the county register." "I know." He looked at her. "He's lying." The air between them settled into something solid and uncomfortable. "Then what is he actually protecting?" she asked. Jack didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone quiet in a particular way that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "He told me," Jack said slowly, "that there are arrangements on this land that go back further than I know. That some of what this ranch was built on was—" He stopped. He called it pragmatic acquisition. That was the phrase he used. "Pragmatic acquisition," Evelyn said. "He means he took it." The words came out flat and final. "Not all of it, but enough. Enough that if someone looked at the right documents in the right order, the original ownership of at least part of this land—" He stopped again. "It might not be Coulter land at all." Evelyn's heart rate climbed. This was bigger than water rights. This was bigger than a deed filing date. "Does he know about the ledger?" she asked. "I didn't tell him." Jack looked at her. "I didn't know what you wanted to do." "He's going to figure it out," she said. "If he's been managing this for 20 years, he knows what documents exist and where they are. He's going to realize your mother's account ledgers went somewhere when she died." "I know." "Jack." She made sure he was looking at her. "We don't have much time before this becomes a different kind of conversation." "I know." He straightened. Something shifted in his expression, the fury banking down into something colder and more decisive. "I'm going to find the original deed documents. My father keeps everything in his study. There's a locked cabinet in the east wall. I've never had reason to look in it before." "You're going to break into your father's papers." "I'm going to look at documents on land that is supposed to be mine." His eyes were steady. "That's not breaking in. That's due diligence." She looked at him for a long moment. "Be careful," she said. "Always." He wasn't careful enough. He found the cabinet, and he found the documents, and he spent the better part of an hour in his father's study while William was at the south barn reviewing cattle records. He found what he was looking for in 40 minutes and had read enough to understand the shape of it when the door of the study opened and William Coulter walked in. Jack was still holding the papers. The two men looked at each other across the room. William closed the door behind him. He didn't rush. He walked to his chair and sat down with the deliberate composure of a man who has been preparing for this conversation for a long time and is not surprised it has arrived. "Sit down, Jack." "I'll stand." William looked at the papers in his son's hands. "What have you found?" "The Garfield Creek water deed." Jack's voice was absolutely controlled. "The original, dated 1868, in the name of Thomas Reed." He looked up. "Not Coulter, Reed." William said nothing. "Thomas Reed is Samuel Reed's father," Jack said. "Samuel Reed, who runs the neighboring ranch, who your father purchased this land from in 1871. He set the papers on the desk without looking away from William. "Except Thomas Reed never sold the water rights. They're in his estate, which means Samuel Reed owns them, which means when you filed this." "The purchase was legal," William said. His voice was perfectly calm, frightening in its calm. "The deed was amended. The deed was altered." Jack's voice cracked on the word, just slightly, just once. "That's not the same thing, and you know it." Silence. "Everything I built," Jack said, and now his voice had gone quiet and rough, "was built on this land. On what I thought this land was. On what you told me it was." He looked at his father. "Was any of it honest?" William Coulter looked at his son. "Most of it," he said quietly. It was the most honest thing William had said in 20 years. It was also somehow the worst possible answer. Jack picked up the papers and walked out of the study. He rode to the Hart Ranch at a speed that suggested something was on fire behind him, and pulled up in the yard, and Evelyn came out of the house before he'd finished dismounting because she heard the horse and something in the sound of it told her. He handed her the papers without speaking. She read them. She read them twice. She looked up at him. "Samuel Reed," she said. "Yes." "He doesn't know." "No." She looked at the papers again, at the Reed name on a deed that had been altered with such careful, deliberate fraud that it had held for 15 years. She thought about her mother's ledger. She thought about the two words underlined twice. Fraudulent claim. "Your father admitted it," she asked. "He said the purchase was legal. He said the deed was amended." Jack's jaw was tight. He didn't use the word fraud. Of course he didn't. Evelyn set the papers down on the porch rail. She looked at him. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." He looked at her directly. "What I know is that I'm not going to pretend I didn't find it." "Jack!" She measured her next words carefully. "If you take this to Samuel Reed, if you take this to the county, your father doesn't just lose the water rights. He loses the land claim, potentially all of it, everything the ranch was built on." "I know. That's your inheritance." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "Tell me what you'd do." She didn't look away. "I'd tell the truth," she said, "but I'd do it right. I'd make sure the documentation was complete, and there was no way for it to be buried again before it reached the people it needed to reach." He nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd already decided. Then that's what we do, he said. What neither of them anticipated was that Samuel Reed would come to them first. He arrived at the Coulter Ranch the following morning, a broad-weathered man in his late 40s who rode with the deliberate patience of someone who has been dealing with problems for a long time and has learned not to rush. He asked for Jack at the gate and waited in the yard, and when Jack came out, he took off his hat and held it, and looked at the ground for a moment before he spoke. "I got a letter," Samuel Reed said, "from the county land office about the water rights review." He looked up. "My father's name is on it." Jack was very still. "Come inside, Mr. Reed." Evelyn was in the front room when they came in, and Samuel Reed looked at her with the measuring look of a man who is trying to figure out what room he's walked into. "Miss Hart," he said. He knew her father knew most of the valley. "I didn't expect to find you here, Mr. Reed." She looked at Jack. Jack looked at her. In the silence between that look, a decision was made without a word. "Sit down, Mr. Reed," Evelyn said. "There's something you need to see." She got the ledger. Jack got the papers from his father's study. They laid them on the table in front of Samuel Reed and let him read without interruption. He read for a long time. When he looked up, his face was not what Evelyn expected. She'd expected fury, righteous, explosive, the kind that a man reaches for when he finds out he's been robbed. What she saw instead was something quieter and more complicated. The look of a man who has spent 20 years sensing something was wrong and has just been handed the proof. "My father," Samuel said slowly, "always said the sale wasn't right. He said he didn't remember signing off on the water deed. I thought he was misremembering. He was old. I thought—" He stopped. "He wasn't misremembering." "No, sir," Evelyn said. "He wasn't." "William Coulter." Samuel said the name like he was tasting something bitter. "Yes." Samuel Reed put his hat on the table and leaned back and looked at the ceiling. Then he looked at Jack. "Your father did this." "Yes," Jack said. "I found it yesterday." "And you're showing it to me?" "Yes." Samuel looked at him for a long time, the look of a man recalibrating. "Why?" "Because it's yours," Jack said simply. "The deed, the water rights, they should be yours. And I'm not going to sit on information like this because it's inconvenient for my family's finances." Samuel Reed picked up his hat, turned it in his hands, looked at the documents on the table. "If I take this to the county," he said, "the Coulter Ranch loses the eastern feed." "I know. Possibly more than that, depending on how far back the review goes." "I know. Your inheritance." "I know what it costs," Jack said. "I'm asking you to do it anyway." Something shifted in Samuel Reed's face. Something that had been closed opened slightly the way a door opens in a house you thought was empty. He looked at Evelyn. "You're in this fully." "My mother found evidence of it 15 years ago," Evelyn said. "She didn't know what to do with it. I do." Samuel nodded slowly. He stood up. He picked up his hat and put it on. "I'll need copies of these documents," he said. "I'll get them made today," Evelyn said. "And I'll need you both willing to testify to how and where they were found." "Yes," they said together, and the simultaneous answer seemed to surprise Samuel Reed briefly, and then he looked between them with the expression of a man who has just understood something about the room he's in that he hadn't understood when he walked into it. "I'll give you 3 days," he said, "to tell William yourself before I file." He looked at Jack. "You deserve that. 3 days." Jack looked at him steadily. "Thank you." Samuel Reed left. The room was quiet for a long moment. "He'll be fair about it," Evelyn said. "I know." Jack was looking at the documents still spread on the table. "It's my father I'm not sure about." He was right to be uncertain. William Coulter came to the Hart Ranch that evening. Not to the Coulter house, to the Hart Ranch, which told Evelyn he'd already spoken to Jack and known exactly where Jack had been spending his time, which told her the conversation at home had been severe. "Henry Hart let him in because you didn't turn William Coulter away from your door, even when everything was complicated and they stood in the front room, all four of them, Henry and William and Jack, who had come in behind his father, and Evelyn, who came out of the kitchen and stood in the doorway and did not move out of it, and William looked at his son first. "You spoke to Reed," he said. "Yes." "You showed him the documents?" "Yes." William's composure was absolutely intact. It was more frightening than anger would have been. "And you understand what that sets in motion?" "I do." "You're throwing away—" "I'm doing the right thing." Jack's voice was quiet and final. "I reckon that shouldn't need explaining." William looked at him for a moment that lasted entirely too long. Then he turned to Evelyn. "Miss Hart." His voice was measured, even. "You've put a great deal of effort into this." "I followed evidence," Evelyn said. "That's all. Evidence that has been in your family's possession for 15 years. Yes. And you chose now to act on it. I chose to act on it when I understood what it was." She held his gaze. "With respect, Mr. Coulter, the timing has more to do with what you filed at the county office than what I found in a ledger." William looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Henry Hart, who had been silent through all of this with the expression of a man watching a river flood its banks, aware of what's happening, unsure whether his ground is high enough. "Henry," William said, "I'd like to speak to you privately." Henry looked at Evelyn. She gave him nothing, no instruction, no direction. That was deliberate. This was his decision. "I reckon we can step outside," Henry said. They went. Jack and Evelyn stood in the front room. The sound of their father's voices came through the wall. Not words, just the low rhythm of two men negotiating something they didn't want witnesses to. "He's going to offer your father something," Jack said. "I know. Something to make the ledger go away, to make your cooperation go away." "I know." Evelyn looked at him. "It won't work." "You're certain of that?" "My father is a proud man," she said, "and he's been managed and maneuvered by William Coulter's arrangements for years without knowing it. The moment he understands that—" She paused. "He's not going to take the offer." She was right. Henry Hart came back inside 7 minutes later with his hat in his hands, and his face set in an expression she'd seen before, the particular look of a man who has had something confirmed that he suspected but did not want to be true. William Coulter came in behind him. His composure was still intact, but something around the edges of it had shifted the way a wall looks after you've found out the foundation is wrong. Henry looked at Evelyn. "He offered to drop the water dispute, make it go away, in exchange for—" He stopped. "In exchange for the ledger and your silence." Evelyn said nothing. Henry looked at William. "The answer is no." Something crossed William's face. It was gone in an instant, but she saw it. Not shock, William. Coulter didn't do shock, but something that might have been a recalculation. A man who has been operating from a position of certain advantage, discovering that the position has changed. "Henry," he began. "You filed against my water access," Henry said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has decided to stop being managed and has found that decision clarifying. "While you were inviting my daughters to dinner, while you were sitting at a table with my family." He looked at William with something that was not quite hatred, but was in the same territory. "I've known you for 20 years, William. I thought that meant something." William was quiet for a moment. "It does," he said finally. "It means I know what you need and what this valley needs, and I have always been the one who—" "The one who—" "What?" Henry's voice cracked on it. "Made the decisions, decided what everyone in this valley was owed and what they weren't." He shook his head. "We're done negotiating, William. Whatever Samuel Reed files, we'll stand by it." William Coulter looked at his old associate for a long moment. Then he looked at his son. Then at Evelyn. He turned and walked out. The door closed behind him. The room held 4 walls of silence. Then Henry Hart put his hat on the table and sat down heavily in his chair and looked at the floor with the expression of a man who has just burned a bridge he built over 20 years and is sitting with the smoke of it. "Papa," Evelyn said. "Don't." His voice was rough. "Just," he shook his head. "Give me a minute." She gave him the minute. Jack stood quietly near the window, and the two of them, Evelyn and Jack, existed in the same space without performing anything, which was something she had not expected to notice feeling and felt anyway. When Henry looked up, he looked at Jack Coulter, with an expression that had changed from every expression he'd directed at the man before. Not warmth, not yet, but the beginning of something honest. "Your father," Henry said carefully, "is going to fight this." "Yes, sir," Jack said. "He will." "Do you understand what that means for you? For your family?" "I do." Henry looked at him for a long time. He looked at Evelyn. He picked up his hat and turned it in his hands and set it back down. "Are you going to marry my daughter?" he asked. Flat and direct. No performance, no formality, just the question. Jack looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked back at him. She had the ledger in her hands. She had 2 days of sleeplessness in her body, and the particular clarity that comes from running on conviction when everything else is uncertain. She had spent 23 years being invisible, and in the last 3 weeks she had been a great many things, and none of them were that. She looked at Jack Coulter. This man who had embarrassed himself in front of his father, for her, who had opened his family's darkest cabinet when he didn't have to, who had looked at Samuel Reed across a table and said, "Because it's yours," without flinching. And she thought about her mother's small, precise handwriting, and the 2 underlined words, and the 15 years it had sat in a trunk, waiting for someone with enough information and enough nerve to do something with it. She thought, "I am that person." She thought he might be that person too. She said to Jack, rather than to her father, because it was her answer to give, "I'm saying yes, if you're still asking." Jack looked at her for a moment that stretched. "I've been asking since the day I walked into that parlor," he said. Henry Hart looked at the ceiling. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. "Lord help this family," he said. But when he looked back down, something in his face had moved not very far, not dramatically, but perceptibly. A fraction of a degree toward the light. 2 days later, Clara came. Evelyn hadn't expected her. She came alone without Henry's knowledge as far as Evelyn could tell, and she rode up to the Hart Ranch in the early afternoon, and came into the kitchen and sat down and poured herself coffee without being offered it, which was such a characteristic Clara move that Evelyn felt a rush of uncomplicated affection for her sister that didn't have anything else mixed into it. "I heard," Clara said. "About which part?" "All of it." Clara wrapped her hands around her cup. "Father told me about William's offer, about Samuel Reed, about the deed." She looked at Evelyn. "And about you and Jack." Evelyn waited. "I want you to know," Clara said carefully, "that I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not what everyone thinks I am in this. I'm not the wounded party. I need you to know that. I know that, I know. Father doesn't entirely understand it yet." Clara looked at her cup. "He sees it as Jack choosing you over me. He doesn't understand that Jack choosing you is the only version of this that doesn't involve me spending 30 years married to someone I have nothing to say to." She paused. "I want you to be chosen properly, Evelyn. I want that for you. I'm glad someone finally had the sense to do it." Evelyn felt the thing behind her sternum shift again, that small particular tear beginning to close. "Clara." "Don't apologize," Clara said. "I hate apologies." "I know. What I want to know." Clara looked up at her, and there was something sharp and calculating in her eyes now. The Clara who had spent 8 months learning Coulter land management. "Is whether you've thought about what happens after. When this goes to the county. When William fights it. Because he will fight it, and he's a powerful man, and powerful men who are cornered. Do dangerous things," Evelyn finished. "Yes, I've thought about it. And I have the documentation. I have Samuel Reed's support. I have Jack." She looked at her sister. "And I have you, apparently." Clara considered that. "You have me working on the financial side," she said. "I've been through the Coulter accounts enough to know what their debt structure looks like. If William is going to fight this legally, he'll need cash. I know where his cash is and where it isn't." She paused. "That's useful information." Evelyn looked at her sister. Clara looked back. "You've been thinking about this longer than I have," Evelyn said. "I've been thinking about this since the day Father told me to prepare for the Coulter arrangement," Clara said. "I just didn't know what I was going to do with what I found until now." Evelyn sat with that, with the particular reality of two women who had been working in their separate private disciplines toward the same truth without knowing the other was doing it. "We should have talked sooner," Evelyn said. "We're talking now," Clara said. "That'll have to be enough." It would be. That evening, Jack came to the Hart Ranch for dinner. It was the first time he had sat at the Hart table as something other than a visitor, and Henry was stiff with it in the particular way of a man adjusting to a new arrangement without wanting to acknowledge the adjustment. But he passed the bread without being asked, and he asked Jack a question about the South pasture rotation that was a real question looking for a real answer. And when Jack gave one, Henry nodded once with the expression of a man who has filed something under useful. It was not warmth, but it was the beginning of something that could become warmth given time and the ordinary shared work of living. After dinner, when Henry had gone to his study and Clara had excused herself, Evelyn and Jack stood on the porch in the evening heat, and she told him about Clara, about what Clara had found in the Coulter accounts. Jack listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "My father is going to try to buy his way out of this," he said. "Clara thinks he doesn't have the cash for it. He'll find it. Then we need to move faster than he does." She looked at him. "Samuel Reed files in 3 days. We need to be at the county office when he does. We need the documentation on record before William can get to anyone who might make it disappear." Jack nodded. "I'll be there." She looked out at the valley. The last of the light was sitting on the mountains, and the heat was finally beginning to ease the way it does in July, at exactly this hour, the single merciful minute between unbearable and bearable. She thought about William Coulter in his study, with his papers and his calculations running the numbers on a situation that had moved outside his control for the first time in a very long time. She thought about what he'd said at that dinner when she'd sat across from him in his formal dining room and held her ground. "My question is whether you'd run from that or toward it." She had her answer now. She had always had her answer. "Jack," she said. "Yeah, whatever your father does, whatever this costs, I need you to understand something." She turned to look at him. "I'm not doing this to hurt him. I'm not doing this for justice in the abstract sense." She held his gaze. "I'm doing this because the truth exists, and it's been buried, and the people it belongs to deserve to have it back. That's the only reason. Not revenge, not power, just that." Jack looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm here." The evening held them both, and the valley was quiet. In the particular way it was quiet, just before something changed, that specific stillness that isn't peace, but is the held breath before what comes next. And in his study across the valley, William Coulter made a decision that none of them knew about yet. A decision that was going to change everything they thought they'd already figured out. William Coulter's decision turned out to be a lawyer. Not the town lawyer, not Thomas Briggs, who handled most of the valley's land disputes and knew everyone's business, and could be reasonably expected to apply something resembling fairness. William had sent a rider to Cheyenne 3 days before Samuel Reed filed anything before the dinner at the Hart table, before any of them had spoken a word out loud about documents or deed dates. He had anticipated every move they were going to make before they made it, and he had made his own move first. The lawyer's name was Caldwell. He arrived on the Tuesday morning stage with a leather case and a professional stillness that told Evelyn the moment she saw him across the county office waiting room that he was not a man who made mistakes on paperwork. Samuel Reed was already at the clerk's window when Caldwell walked in. Evelyn was beside him. Jack was on her other side. They had the documents, the originals carefully copied, twice one set, already posted to a land attorney in Denver the day before as insurance. Evelyn's idea, Nobody had argued with it. Caldwell walked to the clerk's window and set a single piece of paper on the counter. The clerk read it. He looked up at Samuel Reed. He looked at Evelyn and Jack. He looked back at the paper. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed," the clerk said. "There's an injunction." Samuel Reed's face went very still. "Excuse me?" "Filed yesterday. Emergency stay on any new claims or counterfilings related to the Eastern Creek water deed, pending review by Judge Harlan." The clerk had the look of a man delivering bad news he didn't write. "I can't accept your filing today." The room went tight. "Judge Harlan," Samuel Reed said the name slowly. "Out of Cheyenne." "Yes, sir." Samuel looked at Caldwell. Caldwell looked back with the polished neutrality of a man being paid well to have no visible opinions. Evelyn said very quietly to Jack beside her, "He knew. He knew we were coming." Jack said nothing. His jaw was working. Samuel Reed picked up his filing and turned from the counter and walked to the door and held it open. They went outside. On the boardwalk, Samuel Reed stood for a moment with his hands on his hips and looked at the street. "Harlan," he said. "Howard Harlan. Do you know that name?" "No," Jack said. "I do," Evelyn said. They looked at her. "It's in my mother's ledger." She kept her voice low and even. One entry, 1872. A payment substantial recorded as legal consulting to a firm in Cheyenne. The name on the account was Harlan and Associates. Silence. "Your father paid a judge," Samuel Reed said. "Not to anyone in particular. Just to the heir, because the heir needed to hear it." "It appears so," Evelyn said. 15 years ago, possibly ongoing." Samuel Reed put his hat back on. He looked at Jack. "Your father built a long fence, son." "I know it." Jack's voice was flat and rough. "What do? We find a judge he didn't pay," Samuel Reed said. "And we document the Harlan connection before Caldwell gets ahead of us on it." He looked at Evelyn. "The ledger entry. Can you get me a copy today?" "I already have one in my bag," she said. Samuel Reed looked at her for a moment with an expression she was becoming familiar with. The look of a man repeatedly surprised by the level of her preparation. "Let's find somewhere private to think," he said. They went to the back room of the Harker Creek post office because the postmaster Jonas Webb was Samuel Reed's cousin by marriage and could be trusted to stay out of a conversation that wasn't his. Jonas brought them coffee and left without asking questions, which was the most useful thing anyone had done all morning. They spread everything on the table: the copied deed, the ledger entries, the injunction Caldwell had filed, which Evelyn had gotten a copy of from the clerk on the way out because she had thought to ask. She read the injunction carefully, twice. Then she found it. "The filing date," she said. She pointed at the line. "This was filed in Cheyenne yesterday morning. The stage from here to Cheyenne takes 8 hours. Caldwell arrived on this morning's stage." She looked at the two men. "He couldn't have filed this himself. Someone in Cheyenne filed it for him." "Which means," Jack said slowly, "Caldwell wasn't traveling to file the injunction. He was traveling because it was already done. He came here to deliver it. Which means your father sent word to Cheyenne before any of us spoke about filing," Samuel Reed said. "Days ago." 4 days ago at least," Evelyn said. "He knew what we had before we showed it to each other." The three of them sat with that. "He's been watching," Jack said. The words came out quiet, and something in them sounded like a man realizing how long he has been underestimated by his own father, and how long he failed to notice. "Someone told him," Evelyn said. "Who knew?" Samuel Reed asked. "4 people," Jack said. "You 3 and my father." He paused. "And whatever he put together himself from what I showed him in the study." Evelyn thought about the study, about William walking in on Jack holding the papers and not being surprised, about the composure that was too perfect, the calm that was too practiced. "He already knew you'd found them," she said. "When you walked in, he wasn't surprised because he left them for you to find." Jack looked at her. "He wanted you to see it," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke. He wanted you to go to Samuel. He wanted you to bring this to the surface on his timeline with his man in place in Cheyenne with the injunction ready. She looked at the table. He's not trying to bury this. He's trying to control how it surfaces. There's a difference. Samuel Reed leaned forward. Why? Because if it comes out through him, through his lawyer, through his judge, through his managed process, he controls the outcome. He decides what gets revealed and what doesn't. He decides what the settlement looks like. She looked at Jack. If it comes out through us, he doesn't. The room was very quiet. Then we need to get ahead of him before Caldwell files another motion, Samuel Reed said. How long do we have? Jack asked. Days, Evelyn said. Maybe less. They had less. William Coulter came to the Hart Ranch that afternoon. He came alone this time, which was itself a kind of statement. No lawyer, no intermediary, just William in his best jacket, riding up to a modest house with the comfortable certainty of a man who believes he will always be the most powerful presence in any room he enters. Henry Hart saw him coming and came to find Evelyn in the kitchen. He's here, Henry said. Evelyn dried her hands. Alone. Alone. She looked at her father. Let him in. William came in and stood in the front room and looked at Evelyn and Henry and the space where Jack was not. Jack was across at the Reed Ranch, working through the Cheyenne connection with Samuel, and something in his assessment shifted slightly. I'd like to speak to you, Evelyn, he said, if Henry will allow it. I make my own allowances, Evelyn said. Sit down, Mr. Coulter. He sat. She sat across from him. Henry remained standing, which was his choice, and she respected it. William Coulter looked at her with those pale, direct eyes and said, You're smarter than I planned for. I'll take that as a compliment. It is one. He folded his hands on his knee. The injunction buys time. Not much. A few days. He looked at her steadily. I'm not here to fight Miss Hart. I'm here because the situation has developed past the point where fighting serves anyone. Evelyn said nothing. I want to make a proposal, William said. A real one, not the kind I made before. He paused. The water rights revert to the Reed estate, full and clean. I will sign the documents personally and file them without contest. He looked at her. The land deed dispute the original claim that stays private, between the families, a private settlement. Why? Evelyn asked. Because a public proceeding destroys more than it repairs. The ranch employs 14 families in this valley. The hands, the suppliers, That's not why, Evelyn said. William stopped. You're not worried about the families, she said. You're worried about what a public proceeding reveals about the judge, about Harlan. Because if Harlan's connection to your family's payments comes out publicly, it's not a land dispute anymore. It's criminal fraud. And whatever protection a private settlement offers you, it doesn't protect Harlan. She looked at him. And Harlan knows things you don't want known. The room went entirely still. William Coulter looked at Evelyn Hart with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the calculating appraisal she'd gotten used to. It was something close to respect, pure, unadorned, and in this moment somewhat inconvenient for him. Where is my son? He asked. With Samuel Reed. Working on the Cheyenne connection. Yes. William stood up. He walked to the window, that habitual movement the man who processes things facing away from the room, and stood there. My father, he said without turning, purchased this valley land in 1868. He was not a gentleman. He was not a moral man. He understood that the West was being built by people willing to take what the law hadn't caught up to yet. He paused. I inherited his methods along with his land. I told myself for 30 years that what I built on top of them was honest, even if the foundation wasn't. He turned. I believed that. I know, Evelyn said. It doesn't make it right. No, she said. It doesn't. Henry Hart made a sound, small, involuntary, the sound of a man who has been angry at someone for a long time and has just found out the anger was warranted more completely than he'd known. William looked at Henry. Something passed between the two men, not forgiveness, not remotely, but the particular look of two men who have known each other a long time and are reckoning with what that has actually meant. "The private settlement," Henry said. "You'd give the water rights back clean." "Yes." "And the land deed?" "Privately remedied. Reed gets what's owed to his father's estate." "And Harlan?" William's jaw tightened. "That's outside my ability to manage now." "Because Evelyn's right," Henry said. "Isn't she? There's more to it than land fraud." William looked at him for a long moment. He looked at Evelyn. "There's a reason," he said carefully, "that Harlan has been willing to act on my behalf for 15 years. A reason that goes beyond what I've paid him." He stopped. "He was party to the original acquisition. He helped structure it. He has as much to lose as I do." "More," Evelyn said. "Because you're willing to sit in this room. I'm not sure he is." William sat back down. He looked at his hands for a moment. "If this goes public," he said, "Harlan will burn everything he can to protect himself, including whatever he can find that touches this family." He looked at Evelyn directly. "Including Jack." The air in the room changed temperature. "Jack had no part in this," Evelyn said. "I know that. You know that. Harlan doesn't care." William's voice had something in it now that she'd never heard before. Something that was not control was in fact the precise opposite of control. Something that sounded like a father. "My son has spent his whole life building something on land I gave him without telling him what it cost. He doesn't deserve to watch it turned into a weapon against him by a man trying to save himself." Henry Hart sat down. This was apparently more than he had expected from William Coulter this afternoon. Evelyn looked at William for a long moment. "You came here to protect Jack," she said. "I came to make a deal." "You came to protect Jack," she said again. "And you came to the right person to do it." She paused. "But I'm not making deals that leave the truth buried. I'm sorry." "Then what do you want?" William asked. It wasn't a threat. It was a genuine question. "I want the water rights transferred to Samuel Reed publicly. On record. I want the original deed filed properly with the county. I want a statement, your statement about the history of the acquisition." She looked at him. "Not an admission of criminal fraud. An acknowledgement of what happened and who it affected and what you're doing to correct it." "And Harlan?" "That's not my decision," she said. "That's the law's decision. But if you make your statement first clearly, completely before Harlan has a chance to frame the narrative, you control the story, not him." William was quiet for a very long time. "If I do this," he said, "the ranch loses significant value. The eastern land claim is gone. The water rights are gone. Whatever investors. The ranch survives," Evelyn said. "Smaller, more honest." She held his gaze. "And Jack inherits something he can actually stand on." William looked at her. "You love my son," he said. "That's a separate conversation," she said. "Right now I'm talking about what's right." William Coulter stood up. He put on his hat. He looked at Henry Hart, and then at Evelyn, and in his face there was the exhausted, stripped-down look of a man who has put down something very heavy and found that his arms are shaking from the effort. "I'll need until tomorrow morning," he said, "to speak with my attorney, the real one, not Caldwell." "You have tonight," Evelyn said. He left. The door shut. Henry Hart sat in his chair and looked at the floor and breathed. After a moment he said, "You handled that." "Yes. You handled that better than I've handled William Coulter in 20 years. She didn't say anything. "Evelyn?" Her father's voice had gone rough around the edges. He was looking at the floor still. "I owe you." He stopped, started again. "I owe you an apology for the chair in that parlor, for telling you to sit down." He looked up at her. His eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. "I should have told you about the water dispute. I should have told you what we were facing. I treated you like a problem to manage instead of—" His voice caught. "Instead of someone who could help." Evelyn looked at her father. She crossed the room and sat down beside him and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything that needed saying. And after a moment, Henry Hart put his arm around his daughter with the uncertain, rusty tenderness of a man who has been stoic for so long. He's forgotten the mechanics of it, and Evelyn sat still under the weight of it and let herself breathe. When Jack came back that evening, he found them at the kitchen table, going through documents together, father and daughter side by side, their heads bent over the same page. He stopped in the doorway and took that in. Evelyn looked up. "William came," she said. "We talked." Jack came in and sat down. She told him everything. Told him about the offer, about what she'd said back about the Harlan connection, and what William had revealed. Jack listened without moving. When she finished, he sat very still for a moment. He looked at the table. "He came here," he said. "He came to you." "Yes." "Because he knew I'd fight it." "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "he came because he trusts me to find the version of this that doesn't destroy you in the process." Jack looked at her. "Does one exist?" he asked. "Yes." She held his gaze. "A smaller ranch, an honest deed, a statement from your father that gets ahead of Harlan's version." She paused. "It costs him. It costs you both. But it survives." Jack was quiet. "Everything I built," he said very quietly. "Everything I thought I was building it on." "You were building honestly?" she said. "You didn't know." "That doesn't fix it." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't fix it. But knowing now and doing something about it, that does." He looked at her for a long moment. "Samuel found the Cheyenne connection," he said. "There's a land attorney there, independent, not connected to Harlan, who's handled similar cases. He said, if we can get the documentation to him before Caldwell files another motion, he can file a counter in federal court that removes Harlan's jurisdiction entirely." Evelyn went still. "Federal court? Sir, federal court doesn't care about a county judge's injunction." Jack looked at her. "It sidesteps Harlan completely, puts the whole case in front of people William hasn't gotten to. That means a public proceeding. Yes. Your father asked for privacy. My father asked for the wrong thing." Jack's voice was quiet and final. "He's spent 30 years asking for things that benefited him and calling them reasonable. I'm done arranging things around his comfort." He paused. "I'm sorry it comes to this. I'm sorry for what it costs him." Something moved across his face. Grief, real and present, the grief of a man who loves his father and has stopped being able to protect him from himself. "But I'm not going to bury this." Evelyn reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it. He looked up at her. "I need you to be sure," she said, "all the way sure, because once we file in federal court, it doesn't come back. I'm sure." She nodded. She left her hand where it was. Outside, the valley held its summer dark, and the heat had finally thinned to something almost bearable. And somewhere across the ridge, William Coulter sat in his study for the second night in a row with papers and calculations, and the particular weight of a man who knows what is coming and cannot stop it, and is trying to decide in the time he has left what kind of man he wants to be when it arrives. He had until morning, and in a locked drawer in that same study beneath the papers he'd already shown Jack and the injunction Caldwell had filed, there was one more document that no one had found yet. One document that changed the shape of everything they thought they knew. And tomorrow morning, when Jack came to speak with his father, William Coulter was going to put it on the table himself. Jack rode to the Coulter ranch at first light. He didn't sleep much. He'd lain awake going through the conversation with his father the way you go through a thing you're dreading, not to prepare for it, because there was no preparing for it, but because the mind won't let certain problems rest until they're resolved. He was up before dawn, dressed and riding before the valley had finished deciding what kind of day it was going to be. His father was in the study. William was already there when Jack came in. Already seated, already dressed, hat on the hook by the door, as if he'd been there for hours, which Jack suspected he had. The locked cabinet in the east wall was open. The papers were arranged on the desk with a deliberate, careful order. And on top of them, separate from everything else, was a single document that Jack didn't recognize. He stopped in front of the desk. "Sit down, Jack," his father said. This time, Jack sat. William looked at him for a moment. In the early morning, without the performance of composure that daylight and other people seemed to require of him, he looked his age. He looked every year of it. "I wrote that last night," William said. He nodded at the document on top. "Read it." Jack picked it up. It was a letter. 3 pages. His father's handwriting controlled precise, the handwriting of a man who had written a great many important documents and understood that every word in them carried legal weight. Addressed to the Federal Land Court Western Territory Division. It was a full confession. The original acquisition. The deed alteration. The water rights fraud. The payments to Howard Harlan over 15 years. The date discrepancies. The arrangement with Caldwell. All of it not softened, not managed, not filtered through a lawyer's language, just the facts in the order they happened, signed by William Coulter at the bottom of the 3rd page with a signature that looked like it had cost him something to put there. Jack read it slowly. He read it twice. He set it back down on the desk and looked at his father and did not speak for a long moment. "Why?" he asked finally. "Because it was going to come out regardless." William's voice was steady. "You know that. Reed knows it. Your Evelyn certainly knows it. The only question left was who told the truth first and what it looked like when they did." "That's not why," Jack said. William looked at him. "You could have managed it," Jack said. "You're telling me you couldn't have found another angle, another judge, another delay? You've been managing this for 30 years. He held his father's gaze. "You didn't have to do this." "No," William said. "I didn't." "So why?" William was quiet for a moment. He looked at the papers on his desk. He looked at the open cabinet. "I watched you sit at Henry Hart's table," he said slowly. "I watched you look at that girl at Evelyn the way you do. The way your mother used to tell me I looked at her before everything got complicated." He paused. "And I thought about what you were going to inherit from me. Not the land, not the cattle. What kind of man?" He looked at his son. "I built this on a lie, and I watched you walk away from a comfortable, convenient life because you weren't willing to live on one yourself." He stopped. "I couldn't be the thing that made you do it anyway." The room was very quiet. Jack looked at his father. At the man who had built an empire and filled it with a particular brand of cold intelligence and iron certainty, and the absolute conviction that he always knew what the right move was. At the man who had sat across from Evelyn Hart at a dinner table and asked her if she'd run from a problem or toward it. He thought about what it cost to put 3 pages of truth on a desk and leave the door unlocked. "This is going to be very hard," Jack said. "I know it. The ranch will be smaller." William straightened slightly. "I've already spoken with Clara." Jack blinked. "Clara Hardy. She came to the house last night." The corner of William's mouth moved. "She has opinions about the Coulter debt structure. Specific ones. Well-informed ones." He paused. "She suggested a restructuring plan that saves the core operation and services what we owe the Reed estate over 10 years. It's a fair plan." He looked at Jack. "Your future sister-in-law is a formidable woman. Your father-in-law's family apparently runs to that." Jack was quiet for a moment. "You spoke to Clara," he said. "She came to me." William looked at the window. "She said you'd need someone to manage what comes after, and she wasn't willing to watch the valley lose 14 working families because 2 old men couldn't sort themselves out before it got to court." He paused. "She was not gentle about it." "No," Jack said. "She wouldn't be." He picked up the confession from the desk. "I'm going to take this to Samuel Reed," he said. "And then we're going to the federal clerk together, you and me, and we're filing it before Caldwell has time to respond." William nodded once. The single, slow nod of a man who has made his decision and means to see it through. "Together?" Jack asked. He needed to hear it. "Together," William said. They rode side by side into Harker Creek an hour later. The town was already awake, feed store open, a few wagons on the main road, the smell of coffee coming from the hotel kitchen. People noticed. People always noticed when a coulter rode through town, and riding two coulters together with that particular quality of purpose in their pace was the kind of thing that brought people to windows. Samuel Reed was at his own ranch when Jack's rider reached him. He arrived at the federal clerk's office, a small, unimpressive room in the back of the county building functionally separate from the county court that Harlan had managed to influence at 9 o'clock. He looked at William Coulter standing beside his son in that small room, and he looked at the papers in Jack's hand, and he made a short sound that was mostly air. "Is that what I think it is?" Samuel asked. "Yes," Jack said. Samuel looked at William. A long, direct look. The look of a man whose father had been robbed and who is standing in front of the man who did it. William held the look without flinching. "My father is gone," Samuel said. "He can't know this happened." "No," William said quietly. "He can't." "So why does this help me?" "It doesn't undo what was done," William said. "Nothing does that. But your children inherit what's theirs by right. And the man who took it from your father stands in front of a federal court and says so in plain language." He paused. "That's what I can give you. It's not enough, but it's what I have." Samuel Reed was quiet. He looked at the confession in Jack's hands. "File it," Samuel said. The federal clerk filed everything at 9:47 in the morning. The confession, the original Reed deed, the ledger entries with Evelyn's mother's handwriting, the documentation of payments to Harlan and Associates going back to 1872. Every piece of it on record in a jurisdiction that Howard Harlan's influence did not reach. Caldwell found out by noon. He arrived at the federal clerk's office at 12:15 and spoke to the clerk at the window for exactly 4 minutes, and when he came out, his professional stillness had developed a crack in it that hadn't been there that morning. He did not speak to Jack or William. He walked to the hotel, presumably to send a wire to Cheyenne. Whatever he wired, it was too late. The Federal Review was opened that afternoon. By 3 o'clock, the news had moved through Harker Creek, the way news moves through a small town, faster than horses, slower than fire, touching every person before supper. Howard Harlan's name was in it. The original Reed acquisition was in it. The Coulter confession was in it. By evening, Harlan had a problem of his own that had nothing to do with the valley. Evelyn heard about the filing from her father, who heard it from Jonas Webb at the post office, who had been the unofficial information center of Harker Creek for 20 years and took the responsibility seriously. Henry came into the kitchen where Evelyn was doing the accounts and set his hat on the table and said, "It's done." She looked up. "William filed his own confession," Henry said. He sounded like a man who has been surprised by something and is still processing whether to be grateful or suspicious. "I know," Evelyn said. Henry looked at her. "You knew." "I suspected. Jack told me his father had one more document." She set her pen down. "I thought it might be something like this." "You thought William Coulter would confess?" "I thought William Coulter would do whatever protected Jack," she said, whether he admitted that to himself or not. Henry sat down. He picked up his hat and turned it and set it down again. "He came to me once 20 years ago," he said, "when Margaret was sick. He offered to cover the doctor bills. I was too proud to take it." He looked at the table. "I always thought he was just being magnanimous, making himself feel powerful." He paused. Maybe he was. Maybe that wasn't all of it. "People are usually more than one thing," Evelyn said. Henry looked at her for a moment. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise," she said. "You just weren't asking me." Henry Hart looked at his daughter, and this time, the thing that crossed his face wasn't grief or adjustment or the stiff recalibration of a proud man. It was something simple and clear. Pride. Real pride, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. "Yes," he said quietly. "I reckon I wasn't." The hearing took 6 weeks. Clara had the Coulter restructuring plan on paper inside the first week, a document that was so thorough and so precise that when Jack presented it to the federal mediator, the man read it twice and said it was the clearest financial accounting he'd seen in 15 years of land cases. The eastern water rights transferred fully to the Reed estate. The disputed land parcels, 3 of them all along the original creek boundary, reverted to their correct ownership. The Coulter ranch shrank by 1/3. It survived. Barely in the first months. But it survived because Clara's plan was built on what was actually there rather than what had been borrowed against, and what was actually there turned out to be enough if it was managed honestly. Evelyn moved to the Coulter ranch 6 weeks after the hearing closed. Not as a guest. As the person who ran the South operation, the cattle schedule, the water rotation, the account books that now had nothing in them that couldn't withstand daylight. Jack ran the North. They held a morning meeting every day at the kitchen table over coffee that was always too hot, and argued about the rotation schedule and the winter feed order, and whether the east fence needed replacing or just reinforcing. And those arguments were the most productive conversations the Coulter ranch had seen in 20 years. William watched this from a particular quiet distance he had arranged for himself. He was still present, still at dinner, still opinionated about cattle decisions, though he had learned slowly at cost to present the opinion and then let the decision be made by someone else. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He did it because Jack asked him to, and because he had decided in that study at first light that this was what remaining looked like. Clara came to the Coulter ranch twice a week and went through the books and made recommendations that nobody was required to take and that Jack and Evelyn usually took because they were correct. She had found her particular territory in this new arrangement and occupied it with the same composed efficiency she brought to everything. Henry Hart came for Sunday dinners. The first one was difficult. The second was slightly less so. By the fourth, he and William had found a way to sit at the same table that didn't require either of them to pretend the last 20 years hadn't happened. It wasn't friendship. It was something more honest than friendship. The acknowledgement of 2 men who had made significant errors and were choosing to be present in the aftermath of them. The wedding was in September when the summer heat had finally broken. Evelyn wore her mother's dress, which Clara had quietly located in a trunk, and spent 3 weeks restoring without telling anyone until it was done. It was ivory simple, with the kind of careful needlework that told you everything about the woman who had made it practical and beautiful, simultaneously nothing wasted. She did not think it was possible to look at herself in her mother's dress and not feel Margaret Hart standing just behind her, small and precise and absolutely certain. She thought, "I found what you hid, Mama. I did something with it." Henry Hart walked her to where Jack was standing in the yard of the Hart ranch they'd chosen. The Hart ranch deliberately, because some things needed to be said on home ground, and when Henry put her hand in Jack's, he held on a moment longer than he needed to, and looked at Jack with the look of a man delivering something irreplaceable. "You take care of her," Henry said. "Yes, sir." Jack looked at him steadily. "And she takes care of herself. That's the arrangement." Henry almost smiled. It made it most of the way there. "Good," he said. "That's how it should be." Reverend Mills performed the ceremony and kept it short, which was unusual for him and appreciated by everyone. Samuel Reed stood on one side of the yard and William Coulter stood on the other, and they were both present, and they did not speak to each other, and that was as much as could be asked of this particular afternoon. When Jack said the words that mattered, he looked at Evelyn, and not at the Reverend, and not at the assembled faces, and not at the valley behind her, just at her the way he had looked at her across the Coulter parlor on that summer afternoon that felt like years ago and was only months. Evelyn looked back. She thought about the woman she'd been in that parlor, standing in the corner, no chair invisible by design and by years of practice. She thought about what it had taken to walk out that door and say, "Yes, I'll think on it," instead of "No, I won't." She thought about her mother's ledger and what gets buried and what refuses to stay that way. She thought, "I am not the corner anymore. I am the center. And I got here on my own 2 feet." "I do," she said. Jack's hand tightened on hers. After when the afternoon had turned toward evening, and the guests had eaten, and the yard had grown loud with the particular warmth of people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side of it, Evelyn found herself standing at the edge of the Hart property, looking out at the valley with a cup of coffee. She wasn't drinking. William Coulter came and stood beside her. They stood in silence for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You've made it," she said, "in the way that counted." "Nevertheless," he looked at the valley, "I underestimated you, repeatedly and deliberately. I want you to know that I understand now what that cost." Evelyn looked at him. At this man who had built an empire and lost a third of it, and was still standing, which was its own kind of testament to something. "You told me once," she said, "to ask whether I'd run from a problem or toward it." "I remember. I want you to know," she said, "that I understood then that you were asking yourself the same question." She paused. "I'm glad you found your answer." William Coulter looked at her for a moment. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who has received something he didn't entirely deserve and knows it. He walked back toward the gathering. Evelyn stood alone for another minute. She watched the valley in the September light, softer than July, the heat finally honest about what it was. The Coulter land on the ridge. The Hart fields below. The Reed property to the east, working now under its proper ownership, the water feeding through the creek the way it was supposed to. Smaller than it had been, more honest than it had ever been. Jack came and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That it looks different," she said. "The valley." "Different how?" She considered it. "Like it's telling the truth," she said. "Finally." Jack put his arm around her and she leaned against him with the comfortable ease of two people who have been through enough together that the easy things have become genuinely easy, and they stood together and looked at what they had built, and what it had cost, and what it meant, and the evening came down over Harker Creek warm and clear. A daughter was born the following spring. They named her Catherine after Evelyn's mother, after the small, careful handwriting in a ledger that had started all of this, after the woman who had seen the truth 15 years too early and written it down anyway because she couldn't let it disappear entirely. Catherine Coulter grew up on land that knew what it was. She grew up watching her mother run the South operation with the same competence she brought to everything, and her father run the North with the honesty he'd been trying to find since the afternoon he walked into a parlor and said a woman's name out loud. She grew up watching two families eat at the same table on Sundays and argue and forgive and work beside each other with the imperfect, durable solidarity of people who have chosen the harder version of the truth together. She grew up knowing that what you inherit is not always what you deserve, and what you build is not always what you intended, and the only measure of a life that matters in the end is whether you were willing, when it cost you something real, to say out loud what was actually true. The West in those years was full of men building empires on whatever they could take and call their own. The valley at Harker Creek became known in time for something different. For a ranch that had given back what wasn't its and stayed. For a family built not on possession, but on choice. For a woman with chestnut hair and cracked hands, and her dead mother's account ledger, who had walked into a room full of power and stood in the corner and refused to disappear and refused until the room rearranged itself around her. The West was never built by those who owned the most land. It was built by those who finally told the truth about it and were brave enough to stay when the truth cost everything they thought they had.